The first flames flickered to life in the early hours of September 1666 in Thomas Farriner's bakehouse on Pudding Lane. The baker had banked his ovens for the night, as he did every evening, but something had gone terribly wrong. Perhaps a spark had escaped, or coals had shifted in the darkness. By the time Farriner and his family awakened to the smell of smoke, fire was already consuming the ground floor of their timber-framed building. Farriner managed to rouse his household and escape through an upstairs window, but his maid, too frightened to make the dangerous climb, became the fire's first victim. What began as a simple bakery accident would soon engulf the greatest city in England, transforming London forever in just 4 catastrophic days. The fire spread with shocking speed through the narrow, winding streets of medieval London. The summer of 1666 had been exceptionally dry, leaving the timber buildings parched and ready to ignite. Houses stood so close together that neighbours could shake hands across the street from their upper windows. The structures themselves were built almost entirely of wood, with roofs of thatch or wooden shingles, and many had overhanging upper stories that nearly touched those of the buildings opposite. Samuel Pepys, the famous diarist, was awakened by his maid at 3 in the morning. From his window, he could see the fire glowing in the distance, but like many Londoners, he initially dismissed it as just another of the small blazes that regularly broke out in the crowded city. "I thought it far enough off," he would later write, and so went to bed again and to sleep. But by 7 in the morning, the fire had spread so dramatically that Pepys decided to investigate personally. What he discovered horrified him. The fire had jumped from building to building along the Thames waterfront, consuming warehouses packed with combustible goods, oil, tallow, hemp, flax, and spirits. The Thames itself seemed ablaze as burning debris floated on its surface. Pepys immediately recognised the gravity of the situation and rushed to Whitehall Palace to inform King Charles II. The King, grasping the severity of the crisis, immediately ordered the Lord Mayor of London, Sir Thomas Bloodworth, to begin pulling down houses to create fire breaks. But Bloodworth, a timid man overwhelmed by the magnitude of the disaster, hesitated to destroy valuable property. A woman might piss it out, he allegedly declared when first told of the fire's threat. His delay would prove catastrophic. By Monday, September 3rd, the fire had taken on a life of its own. It roared through the heart of the old city of London, consuming Cheapside, the great commercial thoroughfare lined with shops and guild halls. The fire created its own weather system, generating fierce winds that carried burning embers far ahead of the main blaze, starting new fires faster than they could be contained. Londoners fled in panic, loading their possessions onto carts, boats, and their own backs. The narrow streets became choked with refugees and their belongings. Many sought safety in the churches, believing the stone buildings would provide sanctuary, only to watch in horror as the lead roofs melted and the wooden interiors burst into flames. St. Lawrence Pountney was among the first great churches to fall, its collapse sending up a shower of sparks that ignited buildings hundreds of yards away. The fire showed no mercy to London's most sacred and historic structures. On Tuesday, September 4th, the flames reached the Royal Exchange, the magnificent centre of London's commerce where merchants from across Europe conducted their business. The building's lead roof melted like water, and the statue of King Charles I's grandfather, the first King Charles, crashed down in a shower of molten metal. But the greatest loss was yet to come. Old St. Paul's Cathedral, one of the largest churches in medieval Europe, stood directly in the fire's path. The ancient building, with its towering wooden spire and vast nave, had dominated London's skyline for centuries. Citizens had sought refuge within its walls, believing the massive stone structure impregnable. The fire reached St. Paul's on Tuesday afternoon. The cathedral's roof, recently repaired with new timber and covered in lead, became a furnace. The heat was so intense that the lead roof melted and flowed down the streets like a river of silver. The ancient stones cracked and exploded in the heat. Books and papers stored in the cathedral's crypt created an underground inferno that burned for days after the main fire had passed. Christopher Wren, who would later redesign the cathedral, described the destruction. The heat had so calcined the stones of the old church that they fell into a powder upon touching. The sight of their great cathedral's destruction broke many Londoners' spirits, as the fire seemed to be consuming not just their buildings, but their very identity. King Charles II himself took charge of the firefighting efforts on Wednesday, working alongside common citizens to battle the blaze. The royal presence boosted morale, and the king's willingness to get his hands dirty earned him the lasting respect of his subjects. He organized firefighting brigades, personally handed out coins to reward effective work, and even helped operate the primitive fire engines. The key to finally stopping the fire lay in creating effective fire breaks. The Duke of York, the king's brother, ordered soldiers to use gunpowder to demolish entire rows of buildings ahead of the flames. This radical approach, initially resisted by property owners, proved essential. The strong walls of the Tower of London also served as a crucial barrier, preventing the fire from spreading into the eastern parts of the city. By Thursday, September 6th, the wind finally died down and the fire began to exhaust itself, having consumed most of the combustible material in its path. Rain began to fall, the first in many weeks, helping to extinguish the remaining flames. But the damage was beyond comprehension. The fire had destroyed approximately 200 houses, 87 churches, and most of the buildings of the city authorities. The medieval heart of London, a city that had grown organically over centuries, was gone. The Guildhall, where the city's government met, lay in ruins. London Bridge, lined with shops and houses, had barely survived. Remarkably, despite the enormous destruction, only 6 deaths were officially recorded, though the true number was likely higher as many of the poorest residents left no records. In the fire's aftermath, London faced a choice: rebuild the old city as it had been, or create something entirely new. The government briefly considered grand plans for a completely redesigned city with wide boulevards and classical architecture. However, practical necessities and property disputes meant that London was largely rebuilt following its old street pattern, though with important improvements. New building regulations required the use of brick and stone instead of timber, and streets were made wider to prevent future fires from spreading so easily. Most significantly, Sir Christopher Wren was commissioned to rebuild not just St. Paul's Cathedral, but 51 of the destroyed parish churches, creating the distinctive London skyline of church spires that would endure for centuries. The Great Fire of London was a catastrophe that paradoxically became a catalyst for rebirth. The new city that rose from the ashes was cleaner, safer, and more beautiful than what had been lost. The fire had destroyed medieval London, but created the foundation for the great metropolis that would soon become the heart of a global empire. From the tragedy of those 4 days in September emerged a city better prepared for the centuries to come. That was the end of the story of the Great Fire of London, the 4 days that turned a medieval city into the blueprint of a modern empire. If you found this story fascinating, remember to like, share, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss more hidden history stories.